A little bit about Matt. Mathew Pel is a sports performance coach and a sports scientist currently working for Catapult Sports in the USA. Catapult solutions are designed to optimize performance, mitigate risk of injury, quantify return to play, and are trusted by teams in the NBA, NHL, MLB, MLS, and every team in the NFL. Prior to joining Catapult Sports, Mathew worked predominantly in Australia. His experience ranges from time spent with the Australian U19 men's and Victorian women's cricket teams, Australian Football League referees, as the national strength and conditioning scientist, the Carlton Football Club as the senior assistant and strength and conditioning coach, and North Melbourne's FC as the rehab coordinator. Mathew has a vast array of experience ranging from conditioning strategies for team sports, return to play in sports science, and he now lives at the intersection of technology application and innovation as part of his role with Catapult. As the senior applied sports scientist, he works with elite sports teams in the USA, and Mathew will be presenting insights into his own experiences and trends he is currently seeing in elite sport. So thank you, Matt, and we're ready to get started.
Thanks very much, Maddie, and appreciate the introduction. And obviously, it's a pleasure to be here. I'll just give me 1 second. I'll share my slides here as well. Full screen mode. You can see that okay now on your end?
Yep.
Beautiful. So as Maddie mentioned, this webinar and presentation is really geared around some of the back end work of I suppose the more the logistics of running data and the conversations, no doubt, that occur within a high performance environment. Certainly, again, through my own experiences, but really for I think the insights that I get to see now with knowing my custom management across Catapult. And I've got to be really grateful to a lot of my clients as well who have let me in the door to be able to have those conversations, whether it's in medical teams or performance teams, and just really gaining insights as to the logistical piece as to how they're running their departments. And I think this is a really interesting space, and we're really fortunate on our side for Catapult that our data is such a big piece of the puzzle in that discussion. So we're going to dive into that. It'll be a little bit unique as well in terms of the experiences. I think I tell this story quite a lot because I am back in Australia at the moment, looking at what is AFL, the amount of times I've actually had to grab out my phone on YouTube and quickly search what it is. Since I've been living over in North America, I've lost count with how many times. But it's certainly a little bit unique on the global stage. So we're going to dive into a little bit of that and really what underpins my background in performance and complementing that with the various staff that I've worked with, environments that I've been in as well. So I really want to try and articulate this as well as I can and provide some high level insight. So thanks again to FYTT. Obviously, I've got a lot of people to thank in the lead up to this conversation, and we all know how much work goes in behind the scenes. Maddie, obviously Mark and Landon and Dr. Ernie Reimer, since I've arrived here in the US, have just been absolutely fantastic and supporters of Catapult as well. And I think are doing some really innovative things in this space in sports science and sports performance. So we're really grateful. We're really grateful to partner with that. And I've got a whole team to thank behind the scenes, from our marketing team through our technology development team, looking at now our video platform all the way through to our wearable platform as well. There is just so many people to thank without specifically diving into individuals. And then the last little piece is no doubt the organisations that I've been really fortunate to work and learn from. I spent nearly 10 years in the Australian Football League, again, as Maddie mentioned, across a couple of organisations, and was very fortunate to take away some key learnings from each of those environments. And that has really shaped and formed, I think, a lot of my personal philosophy, but also just the collaboration aspect that's required around a high performance environment. So I want to try and I want to really thank those people. Again, without naming individuals, there is a lot of them, but I've had some great mentors in the industry to learn from. So what I thought in terms of providing some of this context, and as Maddie mentioned, I really am coming from that performance background and have now complemented that, I suppose, with the sports science and data analytics side in my current role, but also had been exposed to that in previous roles as well. Since as I alluded to just before, since I got over to the US, I try to explain as well as I can the environment, because there is a lot of people that haven't seen Australian rules football. And if you actually have seen this Twitter post by Pat McKeefe, he probably does a better job of it than I ever could. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen here, and we'll jump over to the other one. And I'm just going to let this play out for anyone that's listening. Hopefully the visuals come through quite well on here, and we'll just let it roll through. It goes for about a minute or so, just over. All right, so there we go. There's a really quick introduction into to what it is, and again, I was just really fortunate to work in that for and played it as well for a significant amount of time. So I'll just re-share the screen here. So just in terms of that context, we're going to dive into that a little bit deeper now, and really looking at the field sizes. I think this paper, if you haven't seen it, by Lorena Torres and a former Catapult employee, Emma Beelan, really did depict this quite well, looking at the continuous play elements of Australian rules football against a multitude of other sports. And sheer looking at the size of the field is a really demanding aspect, and something that I think does present a lot of challenges for strength and conditioning coaches as well as sports scientists who are trying to manage this 18 v 18 obviously out on the field. And now it's around about 72 subs or rotations, as they're called, that you have to manage across the entire 120 minutes worth of play. As you can see, it's a really big logistical piece of that continuous element. And as Pat mentioned, the demands of the sport are really, really high as well. So I think when I'm now sitting in this role with Catapult, get to compare, no doubt, a lot of data across the globe in a multitude of sports. We can certainly see the outputs from this particular sport being one of the highest, if you exclude probably running a marathon, one of the highest that you will see from a pure contact perspective and looking at just the overall demands of what's required as a part of this sport. And really that I think has provided a really solid background in terms of when I'm looking at, and the reason why I tell this story is really looking at the numbers. So understanding what we're actually putting forward to a coach with regards to high speed running or sprint distance. I think we really need to understand how much we can actually drive an athlete in terms of these performance variables within reason, but certainly how much an athlete can handle is something I'm really interested to see how clients are no doubt developing their own philosophy in this space, and really trying to look at how they're quantifying and building their microcycles throughout the week. So what I've tried to do as a part of this slide is look at the detail across each sport. So again, I'm very lucky across Catapult to be able to get access to some numbers and looking at this from a game perspective as well as in season. So the basics in terms of distance and meters per minute, high speed running, sprint distance, and accels and decels. There is absolutely no doubt about it. Australian rules football does take the cake, or is at the pinnacle in terms of performance. So if we look at just a typical AFL midfielder, who runs just over, on average, around about 14.5 Ks, with a work rate, or looking at that density of work at 135 meters per minute, it is certainly quite a step above the rest. Even from a sheer running capacity output, from looking at that sub-threshold of nearly a couple of kilometers worth of running, or obviously just a little bit over a mile if you're living in the US. But I think this is a really cool part when we do start looking at other numbers across other sports, looking at what's actually required within, say, a Major League Soccer environment. And again, we will see some similarities in terms of that density, and obviously that sheer sprint capability as well, position specific. I get it. But what I have been really impressed by since I got over here is just the amount of accel decel work that does happen within the sport, say Major League Soccer, but also looking at that from an American football context. So the sheer sprinting ability of a wide receiver or your skill position on the outside of the ball, they do have a big capacity to be able to complete a lot of that really high intensity running. It's obviously quite variable at the top as well, depending on the style of play, but certainly the capacity that these guys can complete at the elite level is really impressive. So this is just a quick snapshot just to be able to look at these game outputs and really to get an understanding of, and I know these are a little bit subjective, but looking at across the week, what they would typically get depending on the schedule, whether it's over pre-season, as a bit of a guide for those in-week numbers. So that's just a little bit of the background really to understand my context and really the goals of today's presentation as we start to dig into this now is to tell a little bit of my own, as I said before, a little bit of my own personal journey. And that's really debunking what the environment of high performance does look like and complementing that with that running and conditioning element, which I think is really critical for anyone who's working in this intersection of sports science and performance to understand. And then no doubt about it, the application of Catapult technology from a monitoring perspective. So understanding your hardware, understanding what you're actually trying to get out of it from a metrics perspective. And we'll dive into how you can actually go through some of the analysis to complement that, and really take a bit of a deeper dive and just looking at the total outputs, which I think is really critical. And depending on your environment, that plan versus actual. So understanding how you can actually implement this and and potentially some of the challenges that are going to be around that. So I wanted to really highlight that as kind of setting the scene before we jump into the intermediate, which is based on the planning and monitoring aspect. And that will enable us to go into the detail of periodization and scheduling. So every environment that I obviously come across is different in how they sequence their running days versus their lifting days. And I think that's really important for practitioners to understand. Why? Because how we go about setting up meetings, how we actually go about communicating our data through the collection and analysis component, and then no doubt the integration of that within your departments. So hopefully some considerations on that. And the last little piece in this section will involve looking at some running assessment. So some of the innovation that we're starting to see within this space, I'll certainly provide some context around that. And the last little piece is based on the advance, so application and feedback. And I think living at that intersection between the science as well as the prescription is really critical for practitioners. And it is a really big skill set that you have to develop to be able to communicate this in your environment and work with strength coaches, work with coaches overall to ensure that they understand what you're trying to interpret and really what it does mean. So we'll talk about some of the examples that I've put together and obviously dive into that a little bit further. We'll have a look at a couple of session plans from my context, also for what I see now as an American football example, and then feedback. So alignment and challenges, and no doubt that is faced in each environment. We'll dive into that obviously as well. So during the beginner and setting the scene in terms of the context, something, again, I'm really fortunate to work in a dynamic role across the company here at Catapult, where I do get to see a lot of environments. And one thing that I do have to keep in mind and be respectful of is each environment is different. But really what I'm looking for is some key things as to what is as a part of any audit, or this could be for anyone who's potentially looking to go into an organization for the first time, if you are new and you've been recruited, is to really understand what the coach's philosophy does look like. So we'll dive into this a little bit as phase one. But what does their game plan look like? What is their education? How do they actually sequence that across the week from a microcycle design perspective? Do they value it? Do the players value it? What is their communication style look like? Are they personal? Are they actually going into the detail to explain the what and the why to the coaches? Because I think that really does complement the strength and conditioning philosophy as to what the emphasis could be on running within drills or without a drills. Is it isolated based running, or the type of running that's being completed? And we'll certainly dive into that a little bit today, but is it more pattern specific? So when we look at a centre back as an example and what his running patterns look like versus a central midfielder or a wide receiver who's got to run some go routes, he's got some comeback routes, really critical to understand each of these components within the sport. And the last little piece on that section is looking at, is it more a bilateral or unilateral program, or is it a combination of both? And I've certainly seen some conversations around both of those as well. The last the midsection is looking at the what are we monitoring? So there's obviously a whole gamut of technology, Catapult being one of those, to complement what elite sporting teams are monitoring in today's high performance environments. And I think just really understanding the why. So are you actually bringing in a technology to utilize it, or are you just doing it just for the sake of it? I think is an interesting question to reflect on, and also something that you should be really thinking about how you're spending the organization's money for that return on investment. Again, how you're structuring this within your department meetings, how you're communicating it, and is it an ongoing and live conversation that you're able to have continuously. And I think as a part of monitoring, looking at the live versus post, really critical as well. The next piece is just based on the return to play process. So debunking what metrics. I think from experience, we tend to go into a lot more detail in those worlds. So really understanding what metrics you're going to look at, but maybe communicating a less than you would normally report in a global report. And then the last couple of pieces is, as I mentioned just before, how you communicate. So looking at what is the frequency of that communication? Is there an agenda? Which departments are actually involved? And I think really who does look at setting up that that environment, what we're seeing a lot more of now, particularly in Major League Soccer, is the role of a high performance manager to oversee, whether that's in medical and performance, or whether that's a combination of both, and looking at that alignment to be able to see, are the reporting lines really clear on roles and responsibilities, and ensuring that we're there to support the players, I think is also something that I'm really interested in, how teams are setting that up. So, but most importantly, is it all on the same page? And this is a strong ability to be able to communicate all aspects of the performance program to support the players, and making sure that every department is speaking the same language, and really trying to understand what those key objectives actually are. All right, so just in terms of looking at the different environments, and you'll see on the left-hand side, this is just a depiction of what the environment personally that I've come from, where typically you do have a high-performance manager sitting at the top, overseeing a number of departments. And I think and no doubt the roles and responsibilities that have evolved over time to be able to set up these departments. And there is an element of specialization that does tend to occur within those departments, but also an opportunity for promotion as well. And as Maddie mentioned just before, having the opportunity to sit in that senior strength and conditioning space, and also as the rehab coach, you are a really good opportunity to get some diverse skill sets working across with our medical teams, all the way through to our performance and no doubt sports science teams as well. And I think since I've arrived over to the US is to really compare what some of these models
Hey, Matt, I think your audio paused. I'm not sure if it's just me, but if everyone will hang tight, we'll get this figured out. Everyone just hang tight. Thank you.
Yep.
Matt, can you hear me?
We are back. Yep,
We're
I
back.
got you.
Hey, awesome.
We're back.
Thanks.
We just had a complete drop out there. That's okay. We'll push on. I'll go back one slide there. Yep, you got me, Maddie. We were good. So yeah, so looking at just the how detailed these roles could potentially be, versus obviously a role being really stretched in terms of what, say, a head strength coach has to manage in these departments, or they might be fortunate to have an assistant where they are doing a combination of both, whether it's in the return to play space and managing sports science and trying to interpret a lot of this data to be able to make sense of it, to report to the various departments. It is a really challenging aspect unless you're going to start to grow some of the department sizes is. And I think that's probably something I'm a little bit critical of, is how many people we could be able to bring into the organization, and really just understand how each individual's role is functioning. So supporting those people is really critical. And I think as a component of that becomes our roles and responsibilities. So when we look at the communication loop, particularly in the return to play aspect, there is obviously an injury has occurred, and let's just say as an example, it's a hamstring injury, something around the grade 2 aspect, where it might be a 4 to 6 week type injury. Who is actually in charge of that player's program, and then really keeping those communication lines as open as we can, and no doubt the documentation that's required to complement that as well. So whether it's in their return to running, their return to strength and conditioning, looking at the skills of a strength coach, as an athletic trainer, or a physical therapist who might be able to dabble across all segments. Every environment is going to be different. And I think whoever sets those up has a really important responsibility to understand where those roles and responsibilities are coming from, but also understanding the practitioner's backgrounds and their strengths. So it's a very dynamic space. And I think having real clarity in this space can help the athlete, so they know who their go-to person is, and who is actually overseeing their program at any given time. So this is just as a framework, something that obviously working across a couple of different organizations, we've had multiple discussions, even something I've thought about in the background, through my own personal experiences. Again, it's very medically driven early on, and it has to be, because this is a part of the medical team's background, understanding the pathology of the injury and so forth. And then all the way through to that reconditioning element for your sport. I think this is where we see the hybrids, whether that's in athletic training, physical therapy, or even strength and conditioning and sports science, to be able to dabble in and understand what the game demands are, the running patterns, really what those key objectives actually are, to complement the sport, again, across a multitude of sports that I now get to see. So in saying that, I think, again, looking at the role of your conditioning for your sport, there is a lot of considerations that has to happen as a part of sports science. And obviously, if you're tuning into this and listening with regards to sports science, and you may already currently be doing this, or you may not, but definitely the game demands. And I think this is where it starts. Very common themes across a multitude of sports that I do see. Or one thing I'm also really interested in is the language around load management. And for me personally, and the departments personally that I've worked in, is really changing some of that language and communication to your cohort to understand, is it load management, or is it actually prescription management? And I can't take all the credit for this, based on the performance managers that I've worked with previously. But I think the communication aspect to the players, so they don't feel like they're constantly being load managed and pulled out of drills. I think we need to be really mindful as to how we're actually articulating that to our cohort, so they're not constantly feeling like they're being cuddled in some sense, or being managed continuously as a part of coming out of a drill and then going back in. If we're saying we're managing their prescription because of X amount of variables, I think it's a better way to be able to go about articulating that to the players. But sports science can absolutely help with a lot. So whether it's staying on top of looking at your max performance parameters, so your sprints, your accels, decels, change of direction profiles, and no doubt heart rate objectives as well. We mentioned just the return to play objectives before, which we'll dive into a little bit further. But even just understanding and working with your various teams, whether that's in medical or whether that's in performance, just understanding running. So why do they select their velocity bands? Is it a standard 1 to 5 that we see that's in line with, say, the FIFA studies that are out there, or with Catapult as an example, where you have the capacity to go to 8 velocity bands? Let's dive into that a little bit and try and understand what we could actually get out of it when we look at the role of the hamstrings, particularly running at near max velocity. So I think we've got a real opportunity there in sports science to really educate within our departments. But then no doubt there has to be some action out of that as well. So understanding the performance questions that are coming out, the presentation of our data, so the what, the why, the how, and no doubt who it's communicated to as well. And we mentioned a little bit on the education side, looking at those trends analysis over time, and the biggest one being communication. So working with strength and conditioning, and I think this is the intersection that we no doubt get to see, is understanding their content. So what do we actually have to prepare the players for is absolutely critical. So you're going to go through and debunk what the demands do look like. Let's just say if this is in obviously an American football example, you can see there's catching, there's spoiling the ball, away, there's tackling, there's still some form of contact. There is a lot that's required, particularly in a return to play process, to be able to recondition an athlete for the sport, but really understanding that content design. And when I'm going through in open field as an example and cutting up periods within Catapult, I do have the ability to go quite deep, whether that's through at the period level, exporting the 10 hertz summary data. Now we'll start to have a look at some key examples of this throughout the presentation, but I think it's really critical that sports science has a good understanding of the strength and conditioning component and what we're actually trying to elicit with each of, it's not just accels and decels, it's understanding what accels and decels, and strategies that we're trying to overload the athlete with to really condition the sport, to condition the athlete for the sport. So the next little piece is going to dive into looking at working with coaches. And I think this is really, it's a really important skill set that, that everyone as a sports scientist or strength and conditioning coach does need to have. And having worked with a lot of coaches over the years, each of them are going to be different. Some of them like data, some of them don't. So how you communicate, how you get through to that coach, I think is really going to be up to you to be able to manage, but also what you're going to present and how you're going to present it to them. So developing a relationship and trying to understand how much time they have to be able to execute, actually look at a report, how they're actually going about the sequencing of their meetings. And again, we'll have a look at how that could be sequenced within a microcycle. Do they prefer visual notes, or are they more visual, or do they like it just through conversations? So just telling them exactly who might be in a dangerous zone might be a more effective way of communicating with those coaches, as opposed to just sending through a standard report. And as you can clearly see on the right-hand side, there is a multitude of ways to be able to present that, whether that's through visual displays or whether that's through obviously raw numbers. So for me personally, where it all started in terms of monitoring in this beginner phase, I was very fortunate back in the day at North Melbourne Football Club, I think it was 2008, where we actually teamed up with GPS Sports back then, looking at the role of a 1 hertz sensor pod. And as you can no doubt see, the technology has evolved quite considerably as to where it is at today. And that is quite a big sensor when you're doing back rolls down on the ground, and the players are no doubt a little bit angry as a result of wearing that particular piece of technology. But I think for what Catapult particularly have done to evolve the technology to where it is today is a really cool thing to see, with the full capabilities that it has, also with the indoor and outdoor component. GPS accelerometers and really evolving the hardware. So for me, it started as nearly a brick in that space, and no doubt we've got it down to a really fine level that is a lot more comfortable for athletes to wear today. And I think as a part of that is the overall data integrity is something that Catapult, particularly for me personally, having worked at the company now for nearly 3.5 years, some of the validation work that has happened behind the scenes. I was not privy to a lot of that previously. But I think it's incumbent on us as well. And I do think that Catapult does a really good job of sharing this with our customers across the board. If you are interested in it, this is certainly something that you can ask some questions about. But looking at the validation work that has been completed against the industry gold standard of the Vicon product, that time motion series in a multitude of environments and activities is certainly something that we do pride ourselves. And obviously I've prided myself on working with the technology to understand it at a much deeper level. And you only have to look at the bottom left example, completing a 90-degree change of direction run, and the synergy that we're seeing on the really granular aspect of the data between those velocity aspects. We are talking about a really highly correlated metrics that I think you can take some real confidence around. What you're actually looking at is extremely well validated, again, in a multitude of environments. And we really want to be able to put that out there with our customers so they understand this at a much deeper level than they ever have. So I think that's a really important consideration when you are looking at technology-based companies, is what their validation does look like, and also just their testing battery. Has it actually gone through the rigors to be able to get it to where it is today? And that's certainly why Catapult is a leading GPS technology in that space. And really as a byproduct of that, as I mentioned a lot before, looking at the global aspect of these velocity bands, and how we're actually communicating this or reporting off this with our athletes. I think this does open up some real opportunity when we certainly start looking at the various muscle contribution of running fast. So it's not just your lower end density running, it's looking at that sub threshold of high speed running all the way through to those intense based running actions. And again, we only have to look at the role of the hamstrings or the role of the soleus in those particular movements is really critical, that you could get some further information with respect to managing your athletes to help you individualize your programs, having greater attention to detail in your return to play, and then also looking at some performance objectives to push the envelope. So just going a little bit deeper in towards what you've actually looked at previously, I personally feel you've got a wonderful opportunity there within Catapult to maximize that conversation. And then that opens up, no doubt, where we've seen some of the research start to, over the last few years in particular, and no doubt beyond, looking at the validity and reliability of force velocity profiling or acceleration velocity profiling. We've got a real opportunity to understand the deeper level of the data, which is sampled at a really low rate, to how athletes are functioning with some potential monitoring aspects, whether that's around sprint. So not just understanding, have they ticked their max velocity, but when was their last exposure? How did they get there with regards to that? You've got a real opportunity to dive a little bit deeper into sprint monitoring without even actually monitoring it. With, say, timing gates and so forth. So wearing a sensor is now a really valid option to be able to report on your athletes, but also looking at their longitudinal trends as a part of your analysis. It also allows us to go into those return to play objectives. So understanding how their acceleration profile looks like versus their constant velocity all the way through to their deceleration, we've got a real opportunity to be able to dive into those core objectives a lot deeper. But does this open up the conversation for performance enhancement? Have you actually identified one of your athletes that needs some more top-end based work, so more sprint-based work or acceleration-based work? How can we actually go about completing that out on the pitch, on the field? I think that also opens up a really great conversation as to how your athletes are expressing force, and no doubt getting through to those other elements of performance enhancement. Recruiting, I think it does open up some conversations around the exchange of players, whether that's through the NIL or whether that is no doubt deregistering players and recruiting a player and bringing them into your organization. We're certainly seeing a lot of conversations based around that. And the last little piece is just looking at, say, the role of timing gates and the cost associated to that. Whereas if we've got, no doubt, access to GPS technology at a really granular rate, again, you've got to do the maths to be able to work out in your organization what that expense does look like, and budgeting for that accordingly, but also the frequency of your testing and assessment. So that, no doubt, I think opens up some conversations based on understanding your hardware and auditing it and making sure that it is through your own analysis, where in this particular example, if you're using something like a vest to be able to put two pods side by side and conducting some inter-unit reliability assessment, whether it's through the GPS portion or the accelerometry data. And here, as you'll see, I've run a simple T-test and comparing the two velocity traces over time from the start and the end, and they were very highly correlated when we look at that R value of 0.98. So that gives me real confidence based around the GPS portion, and this is again just one example of that, opening up the acceleration data, opening up the accelerometry data, particularly with our player load metric. I think we are holding the players accountable to their data, but we also need to make sure we're doing our due diligence to audit our technology, whether that's in VBT, whether that's in GPS, as I've mentioned, or force plates, to really understand what we're putting forward to our cohort of athletes. And that leads into our parameter selection, and there is a lot. So as a part of your audit, and then diving into the high-level audit of Catapult and what you can obtain with regards to our data, and understanding that there is a lot of metrics, but how you're bucketing those metrics, and no doubt reporting off those, you've got a real opportunity to go into the weeds, whether that's in the distance aspect of the acceleration, whether that's in the actual effort of the acceleration, or the time that's spent within that specific band. So going really deep, understanding what you're actually getting out of the technology, I think is really important to understand. And that leads into the monitoring aspect of your data. So whether that is through live or post, when I look at the various sports, and I've got those listed in the bottom right-hand corner, AFL, NRL, etc. You have a real opportunity to be able to monitor live within Catapult, but also what you're actually doing with it, I think, is really the key outcome. So who needs to know? So, and I'll work backwards from that, because there is certainly a big discussion in the industry, let's be quite frank, around what do we need to monitor, and do we potentially not need to monitor live? And I go back and say, well, have you actually communicated and sat down with your coaching staff? Again, it's going to be a lot of how you're selling the message to your coaching staff, but are you actually sitting down with them and going into detail around the what, the why, and the how, with respect to getting access to not only the numbers, but looking at, say, the role of a live velocity trace, and starting to educate your coaching staff, or whether it's your video analytics people, on the technology and what you can actually get out of it. So when you do get to that particular training session or practice session, I think is really important to understand what those key objectives actually are. Now, we all know what it's like. Some of the coaches are going to listen, some of them aren't. So that, again, it's a reflection on your ability to be able to communicate that and ensuring that you are getting that buy-in. Which metrics, no doubt, are you going to be focused on? There is a lot that are in there, and I think diving into that is really critical, but also looking at the various sports. Do they actually need to monitor live, or are we happy with just post-analysis? We're going to talk about that very shortly as well. And one of the last little pieces within this little beginner phase is looking at just the deeper analysis outside of just being looking at total outputs. So I think this is really critical to understand as well. Not just looking at the overall output at the end of the session, because the GPS report has come through whether it's through Catapult annotations, where it's a fixed annotation. There is this obviously arguments for and against that rolling aspect of the data or a fixed aspect of the data. But I think and exporting that out to do some high level analysis, but really understanding that we can get access to this deeper level analysis to understand things like peak game demands, getting the conversation going and going into further detail with regards to how you're conditioning an athlete for your sport could really open up some deeper level conversations that I think absolutely needs to be had. And these are aspects that you can get access to out of the technology. So I'm conscious of time here as well, and we'll keep plowing through. But this first section, obviously, is we're nearly over and done with. So looking at the plan versus actual component. Again, we covered off just on a couple of pieces of this. So why plan? What does it take to actually plan? And then no doubt the actual, so implementing it and going into the detail. The next piece we're going to move into is the planning and monitoring aspect. And I think pretty industry standard, whether you're coming out of your degree or starting your first role as a sports scientist or sports performance coach, is to really understand the macro level. So what does the schedule look like? Looking at that broader picture of your periodization program, I think is really critical for a sports scientist to work through with your head of strength and conditioning. And you only have to look at the demands and competitions across a multitude of sports, whether that's in AFL, Major League Soccer, NFL, NBA. There is a lot to be able to manage, the sequence and flow of that, and no doubt the forecasting element. And I do have to give a shout out to Dr. Ernie Reimer, because we've had multiple conversations about this forecasting aspect of data. And I think there's real opportunity within technology companies to be able to answer these high level strength and conditioning questions, as well as no doubt the conditioning aspects of what an athlete is required to complement their competition demands. So let's dive into just the micro now. And this is just one snippet of an example of my time spent in AFL. And again, I worked within a high performance department who have really evolved the sequencing of these conditioning sessions to complement no doubt the strength and conditioning component of the two. And I say that because obviously programs have really evolved to get them to where they are today. And I think these are always ongoing and flowing and something that should be discussed internally within your performance department and understanding how you're going about setting up your meetings. This is just one example. When I was working at North Melbourne Football Club in from a return to play aspect, we made a really big focus. If I draw your attention to the Sunday at the end of the week. So going through, and this is probably what you might not be aware of, some of the demands of the roles that are out there if you are looking to get into these particular roles, but planning and updating and forecasting and looking at when we get through to that Monday, understanding what those key variables actually are that we're trying to implement from a return to play perspective. Who needs to know? Is it our physiotherapist? Is it our medical team? how has the athlete presented in the morning? They've had obviously a couple of days potentially off legs, as an example, for the weekend, Saturday into Sunday. They're ready to run again on the Monday. What have they got up to on the weekend? How have they presented medically? Are they ready to run? Are they ready to hit max velocity? Are they ready to accelerate? Answering all these questions when we know we've got a high volume, high intensity session planned, I think is really critical for practitioners to understand. But then also when you're conducting, say, your screenings, are you actually screening once a week? Is it once a month? Or if we are screening once a week, what are we actually doing with the data? Is it keeping the conversation alive? Are we presenting and actioning off that data, whether it is through maximal voluntary contractions? I think this is really critical for the whole team to be aware of how that athlete is coping with their neuromuscular profile, with their, no doubt, their load objectives. These are constant discussions as to how we're managing the players as a part of getting them ready for a training session or potentially getting them ready for a game. And then, no doubt, I think a critical part of that is the managing up component. So going to the GM, going to the head coach or your performance manager, what do they need to know? So when the coaches go into selection and they're picking their roster and understanding which players are going available for the game, they need to have a really strong understanding that those players that you're putting forward within your team are physically ready to go. Now, injuries are going to happen. That's the nature of playing, particularly a contact-based sport, but the controllables are we're trying to mitigate the soft tissue-based injuries. So all of your load objectives, your screening measures in the lead up to that midweek conversation, I think are really critical for the power above to understand that we are presenting a roster, a list, that they are ready to perform at the level that's required as a part of investing in your load management strategies. So that's just a quick little insight into a different environment. No doubt everyone that's on the call or listening to this is going to experience their own takeaways from that and reflect on their own environments as well as to how they're communicating and having that dialogue across their departments. The next piece is with regards to the planning and forecasting. I kind of alluded to it just before, but I think as a start, no doubt any practitioner is going to dive into how they're actually utilizing or collecting their data, and whether that is through Microsoft Excel, whether that is to get the ball rolling, but the planning and detail aspect of managing a player, I think is really, really critical, particularly once load is established. Now we have the ability to plan and forecast. And I think, yeah, particularly, again, to give a shout out, the FIT team from a strength and conditioning perspective, looking at the role of strength training and forecasting in putting players into buckets, I believe does solve a lot of the issues where we're going through and evaluating sets and reps and so forth for our players in the design of their program. We need to be able to automate these things as much as we possibly can. So having actionable data for planning that allows, whether it's medical teams or obviously in that mid to end stage was a strength and conditioning coach to prepare your players for sport is really, really critical. No doubt setting objectives, microdosing, so how we're actually going about managing things like sprint. So if we're sticking to an acute to chronic workload ratio, well, what does that look like? Are we going a little bit above? Is that okay? Can the player handle that? They're all certainly conversations that I think you need to reflect on as a practitioner and understand what a worst case scenario could look like as well. When a player does get injured, now let's go back and audit and see why. Can we avoid that moving forward? These are all important reflections to be able to assess how that player is performing over time in your longitudinal data. So in this phase 2 as well, I think it's really critical to be able to audit your parameters and understanding what you're actually looking at. And one of the things I think personally in reflection that I didn't look at closely enough previously outside of the standard accels and decels is a metric called acceleration density. And I've got to pay certainly some respects to Jason Delaney, who was one of the architects behind this algorithm, developed in consultation with Catapult at the time. But looking at the amount of accel decel work, particularly if we break down the game of football and soccer, there is a lot that's required. We know that now by looking at the numbers. So understanding how that is flowing over time, and is there any more detail we can get out of those particular algorithms? I think that could answer some really deeper level performance questions as to how our athletes are coping with these metrics. And also looking at a little bit deeper than just the standard metrics that we've looked at before. So running a correlation metrics, once you do have some good load variables established, I think can give you, or a principal component analysis, can certainly give you some really deeper level insights as to how you're managing all of these aspects of your data. And this is just concentrating obviously on the Catapult data here specifically for the moment. There's no doubt about it. The collection process with a multitude, obviously, of data sets is also a really big piece of the puzzle. We see that with athlete management systems that are out in the industry now, or evolving your skill set as a practitioner, whether that's in a front-end visualization tool like a Power BI or a Tableau, I think is really critical for practitioners who want to dabble into this space, but also understanding if it is a sports scientist that's collecting and processing the data, understand how they're actually doing that. Looking at the roles of APIs, Catapult certainly has access to that now that companies can get access to. And I think that's pretty industry standard with a lot of technology companies that are out there now. But how we're pulling all of this together and then automating our visualizations out of this is really critical for the practitioner to understand. And then no doubt how we're actually going about reporting it at the front end as well. So collecting the data, actioning the data is really critical for practitioners to understand and even look at potentially some of the aspects that they aren't monitoring as well. I'll just pause there just for 1 second because I know that there has been a couple of questions that have come through as well. I might just, one of those is from Anonymous. So suggestions of how to best communicate with coaches on making some of these changes. So some coaches seem pretty ingrained in the old way of doing things, and it can be difficult or hard to get them on board. Yeah, and I think this is no doubt, if I go back to this question a while ago, this is a really an art in how to do it. And I think for what I've tried to display in this presentation thus far is really reflecting on, have you actually gone through the process of breaking down what they actually like from a learning style perspective, from a visualization perspective. So reflecting and conducting your own internal audit, I think is really critical as the step one. Do you have the relationship actually established? And then no doubt talking their language. So having that connection and then presenting some case studies, which I think we're going to get to here in literally 1 second after this slide, is really critical to understand. So I'm hoping with what I'll display next, you will be able to answer some of those questions as sitting in that middle between high sports science and sports performance. Maddie, did you want to go through that? Looks like another one in the chat there as well, if we want to take that, just as a bit of a pause.
Yeah, of course. And we want everyone to know, just because we know we are coming up on an hour. So you can stay on, great. Matt's going to keep going. There will be a poll and more Q&A, so please stay for that. But if you've got to bounce, no, we will be sending a recording to those who miss it. So Okay, so more questions. Okay, Matt, where do you see the most success in organizations based on your exposure in the industry? So where, and you're leading into that right now, so maybe I'll let you keep going there.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, I will. I will dive into that now. So I think as a part of the integration piece between, no doubt, the wearable data and video analysis, and I think this is where some of the innovation is coming in the industry as well. And I think you only have to look at the reflection of what Catapult have done over the last couple of years now as an industry leader to be able to connect the two with whether it's optical tracking, GPS tracking, and then video analysis. And this is just looking at it through the lens, say, of a sports scientist and as a performance coach. We're actually able to dive into and marry both of these synergies or these worlds together. Right. So this is just as a quick little summary. You can set these dashboards and widgets up however you like, but looking at the performance check. So max velocity, here we have the ability to be able to go ahead, look at their peak speed, have a look at the length of that particular event, and automating those things, I think, are really critical to be able to then walk up to a coach or to one of your medical staff and say, yeah, well, this is what it looks like when this guy is running or girl is running this fast. Here is the exact example that we're seeing, and understanding how these worlds are combining together. Then we can go down into the pitch view. We can look at the actual event. So having everything in the one platform, I think from a performance perspective, does start to centralize everything. And this is a big credit to Catapult for making this investment. But we're seeing the uptake of that, particularly here in North America for Major League Soccer, being a key component to manage an athlete's program and the conversations that no doubt come around that as well. And I kind of touched on it before with some of the innovation, but for what we're seeing also utilizing Catapult data, which is an extension of our platform. And this is some of the innovation that Dr. Jason Weber, to just give one quick little shout out, because I've done a lot of work with him over the last year and a little bit, looking at our data at a really granular level, so exporting the 100 Hertz data, and then understanding things like ground contact time, stride frequency, stride length. We're answering some deeper level performance questions that we've really never been able to answer before out on the field. Yes, we might have been able to do that with a force plate and so forth. But to have that ability to compare your athletes, or obviously between sessions, that's something I've really been interested in, particularly having worked in that return to play space previously. So yeah, looking at the role of that, I think is a really critical, a really cool part of where we're seeing some of the innovation happening as a part of Catapult data. So the last little piece is based around the application and feedback. And we all know what it's like. That was one of the topics of the questions just before, but the amount of planning that needs to occur pre-session, looking at what occurs actually during the session, and then no doubt the post-session analysis is really important for practitioners to understand, whether that's in conversations, templates, who is it actually coming from, I think is a big part of what the practitioner needs to do. It's not necessarily taught at university. So this is something that you're going to have to dive into, work on your relationships, work on obviously aspects of trial and error, get some feedback around it as well to understand how you're functioning within your performance department. But the organization to be able to say, are we on track with regards to certain variables, particularly when we look at this particular session here, as an example, it's a standard acceleration session. There is in American football, there is a whole sequence that practitioners or strength coaches will go through and design, from their warm-up through to their acceleration drills, and then the actual crust of their session. If we're monitoring this and understanding what these targets might be, that allows us to be able to drive performance. So that forecasting aspect, we may have done this session before, we may have not. So it's really important for the practitioner to go back and audit that, to present that to their coaching staff, and then work with them around the what if scenarios. What happens if we don't do enough? Or what happens if we do too much? They're all constant feedback opportunities to be able to provide to your athletes and your coaches. And I mentioned it before, but just the application. So looking at the synergy between both from a session plan perspective, the synergy between coaching and then performance. So bringing both of these worlds together to understand what the key objectives are. And I know it's a little bit of a tough slide on the left-hand side, but it was a screenshot that I did have to take in Australian rules football, looking at the 13 period sequence across the entire activity. So there is a combination of skills and running that's built into it, but you can certainly see the sample size of the drills is a lot less when we compare that on the right-hand side to American football. And we know we've got various position groups. We know we've got a really similar length of activity with regards to the two. The outputs are not necessarily the same. But how we're going about designing that so our coaching staff would be on board, I think is really critical. And I think this is an opportunity for the sports scientist and strength and conditioning coach to be able to leverage off the two and try and align how load complements what the coaching staff are trying to achieve as well. So really reflecting on that, how you're reporting it, and no doubt leading into the monitoring aspect that we mentioned right at the start. So if you do or are lucky enough to have that opportunity to be able to live monitor and provide feedback, what are you actually getting out of it from a volume and intensity standpoint? So are you actually providing that constant feedback? Did they actually hit that max velocity or didn't they? Do they have another effort to complete until they get there? These are all really cool pieces when we're collating live information to provide high-level feedback too. Again, it's just how we disseminate the information, how we obviously go about communicating it in the environment and reflecting on it. Did we actually meet the key objectives that we're trying to achieve? And I certainly I'm very fortunate to work with some programs that are doing this at a very high level, particularly on the football front. And it's very common within Major League Soccer as well. But did we get the most out of the drill that we actually needed to? So I think reflecting on that is really, really critical as well. And this is just going to dive into a couple of scenarios. So as a part of the integration, and if we're able to, within Match Tracker as an example, provide this high-level feedback, whether that's we're filtering this by the team, the player, we kind of mentioned it just before, but looking at the max velocity effort that we see from Henry Mukhtar in that example, whoops, I think it might have just, flipped over. Yep, there we go. Where he's completing a max velocity based run at 9 meters per second squared with after a corner kick, I think is, let's go and have a look at that. Do we actually expose our athletes for that within our training design? Because we know that they're going to have to do that in a game is really useful feedback. This example, when we're looking at an acceleration, so being able to reflect on, is it in possession or is it out of possession? And what was the actual running type? So let's dive into that a little bit deeper. Sorry, it might just flick through here relatively quickly, but it's in the bottom of the screen here with this number 5. So press, being able to get the ball really quickly. How do we go about creating these scenarios and ensuring that we're exposing our athletes to those with the ball or without the ball types of accelerations? And the last little piece is based on, say, a heart rate exposure. So if we're able to filter and go through and look at where was that maximal heart rate that occurred. Again, was it in, what was the phase? How did it actually, was it in attack, or was it a sequence where it was out of possession? I think is really useful to be able to understand how that athlete is responding out on the pitch and coping with those demands. So we've definitely been through a lot within, obviously, the context of this presentation, but there is a lot of challenges in using and applying the data. And I think sometimes, to answer whoever asked the question just before, it is a challenge, no doubt, to be able to work with coaching staff and in a high performance environment. But I also think you have a good opportunity from the word go to be able to ask questions, understand how people are functioning, looking at the role of things like resources and scheduling, reflecting on your own skill set as well, and looking at what you can bring to the table, I think is really important. But planning, communication, these are all the constant things that do keep coming up, because getting that buy-in is really critical so it doesn't fit into the too hard basket. But this is just a summary, obviously, of some of the key things that we've discussed today in the conversation. But yeah, I just, on behalf of everyone here at No Doubt Catapult and beyond, we want to thank, obviously, everyone for tuning in, and to FIT as well for the opportunity to be able to have this conversation today. And yeah, if anyone's got any questions, feel free to reach out to me, and happy to facilitate those. But Maddie, I'll hand it over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Matt. And Matt, just to clarify, are you good to take just 2 or 3 questions here live?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Okay, and we have 2 that are pretty similar, so I'll read them both. Someone wanted to know the formula to calculate ACWR, and then someone asked, there are 2 formulas to calculate uncoupling and coupling. Which one is better? We'll start with those.
Absolutely. It's a big one. And what I would recommend from the word go is if you haven't already, go and Google Dr. Tim Gabbett. He's got some really good papers in that space to be able to go and look at his formulas, as well as a percentage of increase recommendations based off the acute to chronic workload ratio. So it's really just understanding your acute phase of your training divided by the amount of chronic aspect. So whether that's 3 weeks, 21 days, or a 28-day rolling average, there's discussions around both of those. And then presenting that into a formula is obviously something that I did highlight within, without going into all the detail, based around the parameters that I had listed on some of those Excel templates. So that no doubt gives you some good insights in terms of how to then apply or progressively forecast your data. And that's certainly something as to how I had done it previously. And I know how teams will utilize that to be able to overload. So yeah, if strong recommendation, go and have a look at that research, because it's going to go through not only the formula, which then leads into the coupling and uncoupling. So whether that's actually factored in or external as a part of the chronic aspect of your data. So be sure to go and check out his papers.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, and this is kind of a follow-up question to those. How can you use the baseline for the coming season based on last season's data?
Yeah, and this is, you've got to start somewhere. And we spoke about it before in terms of understanding load. You do have the good thing about having or walking into a new program. I think it's really important for anyone that is either transitioning from an organization into a new organization and conducting an audit. So understanding if it is the same coach that you obviously are working with as well, understanding their game plan, and then no doubt what some of those key objectives actually are. Sitting down, reevaluating can give you some really good insights into how they're going about performing in games, or maybe how they're not performing in games. And I think that's probably leading into the next question a little bit, is just the breakdown of the session or game per minute, because those if you're looking at just the totals as an example, I don't think personally it gives me enough detail of the flow as to what's actually happened across 90 minutes of activity. So I've definitely got to credit some of the work that's been done in Major League Soccer with Alex Corder at Houston Dynamo as an example. Has done some great work on peak game demands. And there is a lot of research out there across a multitude of sports in basketball and rugby and so forth as well. But understanding where those flows and peaks have actually occurred can give us some really good insights as to how we then, no doubt, design that within training or within practice, and exposing your athletes to those scenarios based on that context, I think is really critical. So hopefully that answers the question, and no doubt gets some people thinking about how they can dive a little bit deeper into the data as well. But yeah, if you've got any questions around it, feel free to reach out and let us know for sure.
Awesome. Okay, we've got one more question. Matt, you good?
Yep,
Okay.
Go for it. Yep.
So in your experience, which sport have you used live monitoring with the most in terms of coaches, sports scientists, etc., analyzing the data and implementing possible changes to training in real time? So there's a little bit, but
yeah. No, I think, and in reflection, I suppose, with the environments that I've no doubt come from, and having worked in cricket previously as well, which is, yeah, obviously not as flow-based as Australian rules football or Major League Soccer, there is application for all of it. And I think depending on the resources that you have, whether you're trying to do everything as a strength and conditioning coach and trying to set up the data, set up the hardware, obviously, over on the side, and then monitoring, I think it's really important to reflect and consider how you're actually conducting your conditioning sessions as well. Is it close to the technology? Because if that's the feedback that you want to get, whether it's peak speeds, acceleration, accels and decels, etc., you have to be a little bit strategic as a practitioner to be able to get access to that data. And again, we are trying to hold the players accountable. But my time in AFL was a really big focus on the objectiveness on this. And I'll talk about some of the details where we used to actually have this up on a big board display as a TV projector, because they're getting that real-time feedback and understanding how they're performing. Players want to get access to this over time. And they do become really bought into it. Again, it's on the environment that you're creating, and the communication that goes around that, and the value, no doubt, that complements that as well. If you guys value it, then absolutely, you've got multiple options there to be able to communicate that back to your to your cohort of athletes you're working with. So I think AFL, Major League Soccer, they're probably more the two where I definitely see that feedback being constant. But my time, obviously, in and around American football, some programs are doing it really well, and there's probably some areas for improvement in some programs at the same time. But again, if it's working for them, what they're currently doing, that might be okay. You've just got such a high level amount of detail that you can go into in implementing this technology, just knowing what you want to do with it at the end of the day.
awesome. Thanks so much, Matt. We really appreciate it. For those of you who stayed on, we are going to open up a poll. If you would just take 2 minutes, let us know how this went. And Matt, thanks again. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure, Maddie. Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.